Could you recognize if someone you loved was a victim of abuse or the one causing it? Abuse often lurks in plain sight, camouflaged amidst chaos and drama. It thrives when we close our eyes to the stories we deem too perplexing or overwhelming. This is how victim stories are dismissed, and why we began this work. If I Told You is a project sharing about hidden abuses and concealed horrors happening to unexpected people in unexpected situations. Our team represents their stories to you to help you understand them better through the lens of faith and science. As you listen, we hope you think deeper, listen with compassion, and are pushed to action.
Hey there, listeners. Elle here. Welcome back to If I Told You, a podcast born out of one night that exposed abuse and deception in my home, a system that failed to protect my children, and the years-long fight that followed to tell the truth about abuse, especially the truths people work the hardest to bury. If this is your first time listening, I encourage you to start at Season 1, Episode 1, Tell Me What Happened, where I share the night that changed everything. And if you have been walking this road with me, thank you, truly. Because as we begin this episode, I can't help but reflect on the road that has brought us here. This has been a devastatingly difficult journey. The kind of journey, even while you are living it, it doesn't feel real. There are moments I sit back and I think, this is what I lived through? This is what actually happened? And it brings me back to the heart of this project. If I told you all of it, would you believe me? Because walking through this has given me a deep and painful empathy for people who speak out, who flee abusive systems, who try to escape narcissistic control, who say that they were targeted, manipulated, and spiritually attacked. It is not an easy road. It is lonely, it is disorienting, and it costs you more than you think you can survive. So as we start today, honestly, I don't feel polished. I don't feel strong. I feel like crying. Because this episode touches territory that I once had no language for, terms I had never heard before, destiny swaps and organized harassment, phrases that sound weighty until I began to see how they were quietly threaded through this very story. I won't say too much now, but I will ask you to listen with a full heart, an open mind, and have the Holy Spirit close by. Because sometimes the enemy's tactics aren't the obvious sins that we have been trained to look for. Sometimes the attack is more subtle, more strategic. Sometimes it's an attempt to literally rearrange the world around you until you start to doubt God, doubt His word, doubt His voice, and doubt the calling that He has placed on your life. And when that happens, the battle isn't just around you anymore. It's for your reality. So take a breath with me and let's step into this carefully, because what we are about to talk about isn't just what happened to me. It's how unseen battles try to rewrite a life.
This podcast discusses serious and often distressing topics. If you find yourself in need of support at any time, please contact your local crisis center or reach out to our support resources.
One of the occult's biggest tools is manipulating who is for you or things that represent you. It's interference through proximity, through people who are for you, or who once were. Had Elle's father been part of this from the beginning? Or had he been influenced somewhere along the way? And if so, how does that even happen? The idea isn't far-fetched. Close allies are bribed with money, gifts, access to spaces, or influence they've been desiring. Even people who claim to love you get turned in some way, believing they are doing the right thing. After all, Judas thought it was right to sell Jesus until he woke up and hung himself. And if the enemy can't go for who is for you, he will vie for access to things that look like you, things that represent who you are. Why? Because if they can't beat you, they try to mimic you, trying to claim access to your giftings or your blessings in the spiritual realm. And all of this is happening right in front of us, just beyond what people are trained to notice. Hang on through this episode because we're about to dive into something that feels complex but is actually a more common tactic used by the occult, by the enemy, more than we know. And Elle could sense this, that all the cloud of confusion around her wasn't just prolonged battles. It was arrows she hadn't perceived and tactics she didn't understand until God entered in with truth she hadn't recognized. But this revelation would bring her to a crossroads. Because once truth starts surfacing, a decision follows. Do you lean in or do you explain it away?
What was real and what was not? Because if my dad was involved in this, then the one place that was supposed to be safe had actually become an access point. And that realization doesn't just hurt. It completely changes how you see everything around you. I remember feeling like if this was true, then where could I go? And was it just him? And how? I thought back over the past year, the conversations, the long discussions, the prayers, the times I had let myself become vulnerable. I had dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, after all these years, my dad and I were finally building a real relationship. But the truth was, we didn't have that kind of relationship before all of this started. That's what made it unsettling. When everything in my life began falling apart, he seemed to appear out of nowhere, offering support, spiritual guidance, concern, and I opened myself to it. I let myself lean in because I needed the support. I wanted to believe that it was genuine. I wanted to believe a father was stepping in. But standing where I am now, I couldn't ignore the timing. Was the connection we had built over the last 2 years real? Or was it a cover for something he was doing, something he was involved with behind the scenes? Had he drawn close because I was at my lowest, and in so doing, had I unknowingly given him access to my life, and he'd given it out to others with a darker intent? Or had he been pressured into something that ultimately worked against my children and myself? That's what I could not shake. Because our reconnection, it felt new and it felt sudden. And now I was left wondering whether it had been a healed connection or just something positioning me for danger. And if he wasn't who I thought he was, then what else had been an illusion? All of this had me thinking about something I'd had in the back of my mind. As I said last season, I'd always believed the custody decision was not real, a counterfeit judgment from a kangaroo court that only looked real. And if that was not real, then what about the part of this case that dealt with the divorce? Was that real? It was filed. It went to court. But the legitimacy of it all was a different question altogether. At this point in time, I've stopped talking to Dennis, and after what happened with him, I didn't feel comfortable in that location anymore. So I moved to a different place to stay. And that's when something unrelated but odd started to happen. I checked into the hotel fine, and about 3 or 4 days later, I stopped by the front desk for a routine question and to convert some cash into Rand. I had already done it twice before at the same desk. Just as we were wrapping up, another staff member approached me saying that he needed a physical picture of my credit card, stating that it was needed for the cash conversion service. I questioned why that was needed. Like I said, I had already done it twice before and had no problem and was never asked to provide that. The staff member's explanation was vague and wobbly. He still insisted that he needed a physical copy of my card. He even reached out to pull out his cell phone and attempted to take a picture of my card with his phone. When I pulled it away, he then said that, well, I could use my phone and take a picture of it if I preferred and send it to him. And I remember thinking, what? Would that make it better? I still refused, confused why it was needed when all of my transactions had been fine. I walked back to my room, still shaking my head about it. The situation stuck with me because something similar had happened the day before. I was trying to make an online purchase this time for something that was completely unrelated and for something that I had already purchased at least 2 times before, both back in the States and while in South Africa. I didn't have an issue with either purchase, but on that day, the transaction was suddenly paused, and I got a request asking me to send both a physical photo of my credit card and my ID. I remember looking at the screen thinking, this is ridiculous. A copy of my credit card and my ID? For what? It hadn't done that before. I didn't send anything, and I was perplexed why that kind of request, but it stuck with me. And now that I was being asked the same thing by this front desk, something made me pause. Was something wrong with my card? This was now 2 occurrences in almost 2 days. Then, later that week, I was visiting a local shop, and after my purchase completed and the transaction had gone through, the shopkeeper asked if they could keep a copy of my card or even write it down. I stared at her, confused. Well, if the transaction went through, don't you have the details of my payment information? And I thought again, is this happening again? 3 separate requests in 1 week, all different businesses. I went online and checked my bank account. I checked to see if there were any alerts or flags that I had missed out there, but there was nothing. There were no new rules concerning the use of my card from the card vendor. It all felt strange. Why was this happening? To be honest, the whole thing confused me, and I really didn't know what it meant, but it pricked my spirit enough, so I began to pray about it. Sometime later, I came across a video one day of a woman who was a believer and someone who I watched quite frequently. She was sharing a particular dream that she had had recently. She said that the dream felt urgent, and in this dream, she was standing as an observer to something that was happening in front of her. She was standing inside of what looked like a convenience store, and then she watched a man enter in trying to purchase something. He was using the credit card of a woman to pay for it. The cashier noticed that the name on the card was of a woman, so she asked the man for his ID. He then pulled out the ID of the same woman. The woman now knew that this was fraud and confiscated the card from him. The man tried to act like he was sorry for it, but then he pulled closer to the cashier and said, "Please don't tell anyone. Hey, I will even help you learn how to do the same thing." He pulled out from his pocket several other credit cards with that same woman's name on it, and then the woman woke up. The woman in the video that I was watching went on to say that the Lord had highlighted to her that this was like spiritual fraud, like someone who was using the identity of someone in the spirit and using their things as if it belonged to them. And that often these things are first initiated in the physical first, like an occultic spouse who has access to their spouse's credit cards or wallets in real life. They can use those things as spiritual access points, siphoning their finances or constraining their ability to earn. I sat up immediately when I heard this. Hearing that dream brought back a dream that I had now had about 4 years ago. In my dream, I was in a car with my children's father. The dream seemed to be taking place in a time when our children were quite small, or one of them had not even been born yet. We were driving somewhere to go and eat, and I had placed items from my wallet in the cup holder, my debit card, and my driver's license. The dream went on to other things happening, but at one point, my children's father would run off. He then took the car and fled, and that meant my credit card and my ID had gone with him. Like the dream that the woman had shared, was my dream also showing signs of the spiritual fraud that she had described? And were these occurrences of people asking for my credit card and ID a sign in the physical of something that was trying to happen in the spirit? But as I kept praying about it, something deeper began forming in my understanding. A credit card and a driver's license, those aren't random items. They are identity markers. They are how systems recognize you, how you access money, how you work, how you find opportunities. They are proof of who you are in the world. And if something gains access to those things, it's almost like a duplicate self can function in your place. It felt like a mirroring, like someone operating off of the infrastructure of my identity. That's exactly what those dreams pointed to, like someone trying to operate using what belonged to me. So when those physical requests for my card and ID kept happening, it didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It felt like the physical world was echoing something deeper, not an attack on my body, but on the systems that allow my life to function. I didn't have language for it yet, but I was beginning to sense this wasn't just spiritual fraud. It also felt like spiritual interference, like something was keeping me from what and who I needed, and trying to operate as me in the spiritual realm. I didn't know it then, but this was one of my first and early glimpses of something I would later come to understand as destiny swapping. Honestly, hearing this term didn't bring clarity initially. It brought annoyance. I felt like I had hit a spiritual wall. After all of that, with the card request, these dreams, I felt like I had hit a spiritual wall. I was tired, and everything still felt so heavy. Time felt heavy, waiting felt heavy, and the questions that still remained were even heavier. What was going to change in the case of my children? Was anything actually going to be fixed? What role had my dad played in all of this, if any? It felt like the Lord was bringing me information, but I didn't feel safer. So I did the only thing that had grounded me the entire time that I was there. I was working on this podcast. I kept feeling like God was saying to document all this, to say it, to record it. Because if I'm honest, a thought had crept in that scared me. What if something happens to me and no one ever knows what really happened here? So the podcast, this story, became two things at once: an assignment from God and a living testimony. But underneath that drive, I still honestly just felt lost as to what all of this meant. So I stopped trying to figure it out and just asked God for truth. I went on a 3-day fast where I just asked one prayer: show me the truth that I have not seen. It was the same prayer that I had prayed years earlier at the beginning of all of this. And on the last day of that fast, I had a dream. In this dream, I was walking down a corridor with my children's father beside me. On our left were several different rooms. As we passed each room, he would open up the door to them. Inside each room were things that he had taken from me over the years. Every time a door opened, I remember feeling shocked. This too? And this? But what unsettled me the most was his face. Every time he opened the door, it was like he had on different masks. He would open up one door and he would look one way. Then he would open up another door and he would look a different way. The third and fourth, the fifth, and so forth and so on. Different versions of him, but the same person. I woke up knowing that that dream mattered. The next day, a video kept popping up on my feed. Learning my lesson from before, I was hesitant to watch anything that I had not been watching for over some time. But this one kept coming, and I felt a release from the Lord to go ahead and view it. When I clicked on the video, the woman started out by saying something to the effect of, "Congratulations, you're waking up." And so are many others whose lives have been destiny swapped. I remember when I heard that term again, I was like, destiny swapping? Imagine someone who has clearly prepared for and worked hard for a sustainable life. They have studied, they have trained, they have helped others succeed. Everything points towards them stepping into a certain role. But then, repeatedly, something derails them at the final moment. Not once, not a fluke, but again, a pattern. And at the same time, someone else less prepared, less aligned, and less gifted, and previously nowhere near that path, suddenly steps into the very position that the first person was moving towards. That is a destiny swap. This mystery is described in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 7, where it says, "I have seen slaves on horseback, while princes go on foot like slaves." It is a reversing of how God designed things to be, not a calling being erased, but a life being diverted. And to this, people will often say, well, no one can steal what God placed in you. And I do believe that to be true. But circumstances can be manipulated to move you away from the people, places, and positioning where that calling was meant to be unfolded at. And suddenly, someone else is standing in spaces that look like they were built around your life. To help explain what I mean, think about a real legal case that made national headlines in North Carolina in the United States. A woman sued her husband's mistress under the state's alienation of affection law, a law that allows a spouse to file a civil lawsuit against someone who knowingly interferes in a marriage. She was awarded over $1 million in damages. Now, this case drew attention because the alleged mistress wasn't a stranger. She had been a very close friend to the family, had proximity, had access, and had relationship. According to the reports, the affair didn't just end a marriage. The wife described losing her home, her life, her partnership, her role functioning as it once had, all while another woman, who was her best friend, stepped into that space, into the house, into daily life, and into proximity with her children. She even described some signs of possible witchcraft. She described seeing small teeth littered throughout the house. Now, remove the legal language for a moment and just look at the pattern. You have a woman who loses her marital position, loses daily life with her husband, loses stability for her motherhood, all while another woman moves into the structure that used to be hers. That is a picture of displacement. That's the human, relational version of what I mean when I talk about a destiny swap. That's what made this hit so hard, because as I looked at my reality, just 4 years ago, I was a stay-at-home mom, focused on my children, my work, my calling. My life had a shape, a direction. Then, through this custody case, all of a sudden, my life doesn't resemble what I had once known. I wasn't with my children. The role I carried in their daily lives had shifted. The structure of my world greatly changed, not gradually, not by choice, but through outcomes that felt engineered. And so I am left with this startling possibility. What if this custody case wasn't just hardship? What if this counterfeit verdict was interference, an attempt to reroute what my life was supposed to carry, to divert me from who I was designed to be? Inside the church, people struggle with this idea. I would have too, if it hadn't been that I have lived through this, because it feels too large, too organized, too intentional. But this isn't about waking up one day in a different life. It's about 1,000 tiny, small manipulations that create massive redirections until one day you look up and realize the life that you were building is no longer the life that you're standing in. And that realization didn't just make me angry, it brought me to my knees. Lord, bring me my destiny back, bring my children back, bring my motherhood back, bring my ministry back, bring my opportunities back, bring my life back.
The depth of that prayer was real and true. Lord, bring my children back, bring my ministry back, bring my life back. Some diversions don't feel dramatic while they're happening. For some, it's just being a few degrees off course. And then sometimes it's a complete reversal. A life turned almost 180 degrees from the direction God once had it heading. In Elle's case, the questions were no longer small. What happens when you learn something like this has been happening in your life? The knowledge itself is a kind of deliverance. an awakening to the fact that things haven't been as they should for a long while. And in his power, he begins to break the very things that have been holding you, keeping you from what was rightfully yours. Around Elle, something would seem to break. Something was starting to clear. Whatever was keeping her in this gauntlet, in this arena, seemed to be suddenly breaking free. And what lies ahead wasn't just escape, it was a choice. Would she step fully into the path God had marked for her, or into something that looked right, felt familiar, but was actually a doorway back into the very cycle she had been praying to be freed from?
While all of this was happening, I was still waiting on my visa. And up until this point, it had felt like there were invisible hands keeping me in one place. Like there was one hand keeping me surrounded with the wrong people, and another hand brushing away the ones who could help. One afternoon, I finally got an email from the visa specialist who had been helping me. She asked if we could speak, or ideally, if we could meet up briefly. I responded yes immediately. I, too, had been meaning to reach out to get a status update. When we met, the first thing she said was this: "I don't know what's been going on." She told me she had been tracking my visa situation. It, like all of her other clients, had been months delayed, but the pause on expat visas was now finally clearing, almost 5 months after it had began. Then she said, "Before that though, it feels like something else was going on." She said the way that she is with her clients, even if there's a delay, that she's always intentional and punctual about checking in with all of them. A quick call, a brief email. But for some reason, for the past 3 months, she had been trying to do that with me. But every single time, something would immediately interrupt her. A call would come through, another case would suddenly demand attention, and then she would get pulled away. She said that after this happened several times, she started noticing the pattern, because that wasn't like her. She was organized, she followed up, and she doesn't just forget clients. So she said she began to pray about it. And she said, "It feels like some kind of spiritual interference, like something doesn't want me to stay in contact with you." I literally stared at her, mouth wide open. Here was someone articulating the very thing that I had been sensing and suspecting. I had been saying that it literally felt like people, for lack of a better word, were being blown away from me. And on my end, I was experiencing what she was experiencing. Every time I thought to call her, I would suddenly get distracted, or I would get pulled into something else, or I'd remember too late in the day. And this happened for months. It was like our focus to do the task of checking in kept getting hijacked. She went on to say that during this time, other strange things were happening as well. That even when she tried to do checkups with her clients, it was like her emails weren't going through. She would send an email, but then the client would say that they hadn't received it. Out of nowhere, a former client started posting negative reviews about her business, so much so that it was deterring new clients. She said between the pause in expat visas, the missed emails, and the loss in clients from the negative reviews, she almost came close to just shutting down her business altogether. I looked at her again. "All of this?" She nodded. "Yes," but she said something about it was off to me. I knew that these weren't isolated events. I knew that this was spiritual warfare. So she said she began to fight harder in prayer and did some fasting, and she finally saw some breakthrough. She handed me my paperwork and said, "God must have a really big reason as to why you're here and why you came. Because the more I prayed, I can sense that something is fighting your being here, like something is blocking your paperwork from happening." She grabbed my hand and said, "God is with you." In that moment, we both hugged and we prayed right there on the street. There's nothing like praying with a fellow believer who didn't just dismiss the feeling, but actually sought the Lord about it and fought in the Spirit. That conversation was honestly a turning point. because this wasn't just in my head anymore. Someone outside of me had been experiencing the same resistance I'd been feeling around my life, around my movement, around my relationships. South Africa wasn't just a place I had traveled to. It's connected to dreams that I had had about my future. So if something interfered with my visa, it wasn't just blocking travel. It was impacting destiny. After that prayer, my mindset shifted. Sometimes interference doesn't try to take you out directly. Often, it just tries to stall you long enough in one place so that you never arrive. So now I'm flying back to the States, and I remember the day I was to fly out, the weather just felt so unnatural. It was heavily storming, the wind was blowing, and it was so cold and so dark and cloudy the entire day. I said before that it felt like there were invisible hands that had been fighting to keep me fixed in one place in the country. But now I was feeling a resistance, as if those same hands were fighting to let me go. The rest of the day dragged in a way that felt unusual. Packing my bag took twice as long. My food orders would stall. My driver to the airport was delayed. And I remember, strangely enough, there was traffic at a time when there shouldn't have been traffic. When I arrived at the airport, they told me that I had missed my flight. But here's the part that didn't make sense. The plane was actually still there. Boarding had not finished. And in fact, the flight had even been delayed. And still, I was told that I could not board. It was similar to the time when I was flying to the conference and I had missed the flight 2 or 3 times before I even got there. I remember adamantly trying to work something out. I called different airport personnel, I asked security, but none of it seemed to work. At that point, I just sat on the airport floor, just weeping, because I had no idea what was going on. I was rebooked for another flight, but that would be a few days later, and it was right on the deadline for my visa exit. So I took the car back to the hotel and waited. When I finally boarded the flight, I felt 2 things at once: relief and dread. I didn't know what I was flying back into. I just knew that nothing was going to be the same. The first leg of my flight felt normal, nothing unusual. But then later, I began to sense the Lord try to tell me, pay attention, keep your eyes open. I didn't know what for. And honestly, I just wanted to sleep on the plane and just forget about everything. But the Lord was prompting me to do otherwise. When I was walking now to my second flight, I remember I noticed something. I was among the last few people in line to board at the gate. And I remember that as I approached the gate, there was a heavy-set woman with reddish hair that was sitting right at the entry to the gate area. I remember that when she saw me, she then stood up and said, "Oh, okay, let's go," and then picked up her bag and joined the others in line. It was almost like she was waiting for me because there was no one else that boarded after us. The irony is that we ended up also in the same row. I remember she kept turning around and making glances towards me as if she wanted to say something. Eventually, she would say a few things here and there. And even beyond me, there was another woman as we walked into the plane, a few rows ahead of us, that she also caught the attention of. And the 2 of them began speaking. So if you can imagine, the woman with the red hair is sitting by the window. I'm sitting on the aisle of that same row. And then the woman that we passed is about 2 rows ahead of us. The woman with the red hair and the woman that we passed now end up in what seems like an engaging back and forth conversation. And I'm awkwardly positioned in the middle of them. I stood up and asked if they knew each other and if they would prefer to sit together. And they said, oh no, that they don't know each other at all. I thought it was odd. Such a conversation so quickly, you would think that they were mates or friends or something. I sat back down. And by this point, the woman with the red hair seemed to be trying to find a way to bring me into the conversation. But honestly, I wasn't really interested. Not for anything of her. I honestly was tired. And I was remembering what the Lord was saying, to just pay attention and keep my eyes open. As the two of them talked, I noticed that on the right side of me in the next aisle, there was a man that was sitting by the window seat as well. What I noticed about him was that he was sitting in a kind of awkward position. His back was propped against the window like he wanted to kind of doze off and sleep. But he had his phone on his lap as if he was watching something. But I noticed that he didn't have headphones on or any ear pods, but he kept his phone positioned on his lap facing outward towards the aisle toward me, like that. This wasn't a short flight. He sat like that the entire time, not moving, not budging until the very end of the flight. What was that? When we landed, I remember I stopped to eat something because this was going to be a little bit of a longer flight. I almost didn't buy water because I knew that I was going to have to enter another security checkpoint and I didn't want to have to throw it away. But in that moment, I felt the Lord say to me, "No, go and buy water." And I wondered, why? This would be akin to you going to the airport, checking in for your flight, and the Lord tells you to go buy a jug of water, knowing that TSA is going to tell you to pour it out. That's exactly what the feeling felt like. But that feeling would not lift for me, so I stopped and just bought the smallest bottle of water that I possibly could. Sure enough, when I got to the security checkpoint, they asked me to either throw it away or drink it. And so I paused and said, I'm going to drink it instead of throwing it out. That delay mattered. A few minutes later came a middle-aged man rushing up behind me with sunglasses and a hat. He seemed to be running, but when he now saw me standing there, he paused and stopped and said, "Oh." I stood there drinking my water and stood out of the way and said, "Go ahead in front of me, I'm still drinking this." He kept insisting that he could stop and wait for me. And I looked at him thinking, that makes no sense, just go in front of me. After 2 or 3 times of going back and forth, he finally went ahead of me. I remember as I was drinking my water, I felt the Lord tell me to pause and to watch. I would watch this man slowly go through the security process. He would slowly take off his shoes, slowly take off his belt, take off his sunglasses and hat. He seemed like he was stalling for some reason. And every few seconds, he would turn back around and look towards me. I remember initially, honestly, I felt confused. I didn't know what that was about. I just kept focusing on drinking my water, and once I was finished, I entered through the security checkpoint. I remember the man in front of me, as he finished, he gathered his things and went ahead and stood behind a wall just slightly out of my view. But from where I was standing, I could see him slowly putting his belt back on, but every few seconds, he was turning back around and looking back towards where I was standing. I remember thinking, is he waiting on someone? I turned around behind me. There was no one behind me. I even kind of looked beyond the gate area, and there was no one else that was lined up further down. What was he looking at? Who was he waiting on? I felt the Lord prompt me to not walk directly in front of him, but to exit through another way. And so I noticed that there was a small shop across the aisle from where I was. I gathered my things, put my jacket back on, and then stepped inside of the store. From my vantage view, I could now see the same gentleman standing against the wall, now fully dressed, but continuously looking behind as if he was still waiting for someone. The first time he turned around and he didn't see me, now he looked confused and started to look like he was searching adamantly. I remember thinking, was he waiting on me? I stood watching him for a second as he crossed back over the area, but he wasn't allowed to cross back over the gate area, so he stood there looking, waiting, and then eventually walked away. I remember praying in that moment and saying, God, what exactly are you showing me here? What did I just see? I knew that the Lord wanted me to see that for a reason. But I knew one thing. I didn't know exactly what that man was doing, but I did know one thing. If I hadn't bought the bottle of water like the Lord has said, I wouldn't have stopped enough to see him rushing in. I wouldn't have stopped long enough to see him furtively turning back and forth, looking to see if I was there. And I wouldn't have stopped to be able to see him still come back towards the gate, looking as if he was waiting for someone to come. I knew that I had been shown this for a reason, and the Lord's words would stay with me. Pay attention and keep your eyes open. I remember when I boarded this next flight, I was looking ahead, looking for the row I was sitting in. When I found my row, at the aisle seat of where I was sitting was an elderly woman. From the minute I sat down, it seemed like she wanted to engage me in a conversation. I remember I answered a few questions here and there, and then turned my head towards the window, just seeking a moment just to process what I had just seen outside by the gate. Then I started to notice something. The same questions that the woman in the aisle seat next to me was asking me were now the same questions in conversation that was taking place in the row in front of me. It was a woman and the man, and the very same questions that the woman in my row asked me, it seemed that they were having that literal same conversation. What they were asking each other was, where are you flying to? Where are you getting off at? When the person would respond, then the person in the row in front of them also was responding with the same answer as well. It's like someone asking you, where are you traveling to? And you say home. And then the person in the row in front of you is asking the person next to them the same question, where are you traveling to? Except this time the person responds, oh, I'm flying to Toronto. And then the person in front of the row in front of them is having the same conversation. And then they also respond, I'm flying to Toronto. This would happen for at least up to 4 rows in front of me until all of a sudden, individuals in those rows all would stand up and say, oh my gosh, I'm flying to Toronto. I'm flying to Toronto. I'm also flying to Toronto. As I watched this play out, I couldn't help but laugh. Like, what in the world was going on? It was odd and funny to me, but I also know that this wasn't coincidence. It felt staged in a way that I couldn't explain, like there was a scene playing out around me. Now later, I would come to learn the term for what I had just witnessed. This was something called street theater. Not the viral dance videos or public performances that you see when someone enters into like a busy train station. This is where these are interactions that are designed to unnerve or keep someone in psychological stress, to make them feel that something strange was happening around them. Whether coincidence or intention, the effect is the same. Your nervous system stays alert, and your sense of normalcy gets chipped, even if just a bit. And sitting on that plane, watching conversation after conversation mirror itself in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just traveling. I was inside something being played out. When we finally landed in the States, I was exhausted. As I sat down by my gate, I would see that first man from the security checkpoint again. He was walking the terminal near my gate, kind of walking back and forth like he was still looking for someone. I continued to just kind of sit low in my chair until he finally walked away. And that's when I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. Leaving South Africa hadn't ended it. Whatever this was had followed me home.
If someone you or someone else has walked through something like this, when you tried to explain it, what did people say? For those who know their life has shifted far from what it once was, or who notice strange patterns in people and social situations playing out around them, and don't have language for what they're experiencing, we see you. Experiences like this are difficult to explain by design, and that makes them easy to dismiss. But dismissal doesn't make an experience disappear. It just leaves the person carrying it alone. So we and others have told you, do you sit with it or explain it away? Keep listening, because things were still unfolding. Because now that Elle was home, what would her father say? And if her father had been involved, Then what did that mean about her mother?
Hey you, thanks for listening. If you've known abuse, assault, loss, or fear, and most especially if you're protecting a child, your voice matters. Stay alert, stay listening, and trust the Holy Spirit when He nudges you forward. We'll meet you in the next episode.